Hello everybody, and welcome to the story summary for the final chapter in the Legacy of Kain series, Legacy of Kain Defiance. It is worth mentioning that a couple of sequels were planned, but were unfortunately ultimately discontinued. As for Defiance, this one, we follow both Kain and Raziel following the events of Soul Reaver 2, switching off between the two of them chapter by chapter. For the purposes of this summary, however, I'll talk about Raziel's perspective first, and then we'll follow Kain up until the point that they've met each other, and then I'll talk about the story as it would naturally unfold. As far as that story goes, some new ideas and questions kind of pop out of nowhere, but it's implemented pretty well, although a couple of those questions are not really answered directly. So I might pause on a more frequent occasion to explain some of those connections and elaborate on some of those points. So we'll get into it, and as we do, we actually start with Kain's perspective. He's giving a pretty cool monologue about destiny, and we see some of the opening cutscenes from Soul Reaver 1. But as I said, I'd like to start on Raziel's side of things, so we'll come back to Kain. When we first start with Raziel, we see he's trapped in the underworld, and he's refusing to feed on souls, starving himself for a few reasons. For one, Raziel has come to the conclusion that the Elder feeds on souls through his servants. And while the Elder stresses that he created Raziel, it doesn't seem to be the case, but he does seem to have created this connection of feeding. At the very least, it's obvious the Elder wants Raziel to consume souls, and Raziel's defiantly refusing to please him. The other major reason, which the Elder is quick to point out, taunting Raziel, calling him a coward, is that Raziel knew he could not be destroyed from starvation as long as he was destined to enter the Reaver, but could not enter the Reaver as long as he remained starving in the underworld. Now, if we were watching Raziel do this for centuries, it would get quite boring, so this is of course the moment when Raziel decides to face the music, and he eats a soul. The Elder, seeming to be pleased with this, guides Raziel through the underworld to places where he can do menial tasks, such as eating more souls and killing a bunch of sluaw, who do not feed the Elder when they themselves consume souls, which is really the only reason the Elder hates them. During these errands, Raziel just makes a break for it and manages to escape from the underworld being a location exclusive to the spectral realm that physically lies beneath the location of the spectral realm that crosses over with the material, similar to the chamber where Raziel first started in Soul Reaver 1. This little escape really just shows that the Elder has a hard time controlling Raziel, but Raziel still needs to find his way from the spectral realm to the material realm in order to at least learn about his fate, if not face it. He quickly finds a conduit to the material realm, but if you recall, the Elder is the one who provides Raziel with these conduits, and says that Raziel is more useful to him as a wraith until he's more obedient, and denies Raziel passage. Raziel, determined to do things on his own terms, begins searching for another way into the material realm, and during his search encounters more agents of the Elder, who of course consume souls on the Elder's behalf, and they immediately attack Raziel. We've maybe not seen these creatures so far in the series because they've just been lurking in the shadows, not being hostile to anybody, but after the attack, Raziel notes that he believes the Elder wants him to feed him as long as possible and possibly become a mindless creature like one of these before entering the Reaver. Raziel pokes around and finds out he's in a cemetery, and among the many corpses present, he finds out that some of them are suitable for a certain type of possession, something he's never needed to do thanks to the conduits. This, however, seems to be a relatively simple means of accessing the material realm without the Elder's assistance. He emerges in a rotting corpse that he himself calls a loathsome vessel, but he says with an effort of will he can change that as well. And I would perhaps speculate that he's able to do so accurately because of his experience with the conduits. I mean, it's clearly to some degree for the audience, and certain characters will need to recognize him later. But he begins making his way back out through the graveyard, still being harassed by the Elder, despite having made an escape to the material realm, and he quickly encounters a group of vampire hunters who are discussing a ghost haunting the pillars. They attack Raziel, and he kills them all, eats their souls. He recognizes these people as Mobius's mercenary vampire hunters, which puts him in the era of the First Blood Omen. He says that because these guys are around, he's lost 500 years since the events that ended Soul Reaver 2. He then points out, as we also should have recognized, that the ghost they were discussing was of course Ariel. Raziel thought to get his bearings in this era by going to talk to her at the pillars after leaving the graveyard. There's still of course a whole rigmarole to doing this, and while exploring, a group of animated corpses spring up out of nowhere to taunt Raziel by name before attacking. After dealing with them, Raziel notes how he must be using a similar method to these guys to enter the material realm from the spectral realm, and is therefore not altogether original. Over time, we come to understand that these things are in fact the Unspoken, otherwise known as the Hilden, who are trying to scratch through the weakening seal of the pillars. They can also kind of mold the form of the corpses they inhabit. You can see their bony little wings. But we might also speculate that a lot of the undead we see in Blood Omen 1 could very well be Hilden themselves. Raziel begins to notice that there are sealed vampire ruins that are older than the cemetery, And not unlike the vampire ruins in Soul Reaver 2, they contain many secrets and history lessons. He gains access to one such chamber by using the Reaver like a key, as we'd seen in the past, and within the chamber is a portal which leads to a larger vampire ruin containing, of course, a lot of murals. The first few of these show us nothing really new. We see the vampire and Hilden war, and many heroic depictions of the Reaver, showing it being wielded by its prophesied hero. This all causes Raziel to wonder, if he were supposed to be that hero, why then would the Reaver try to consume him? Another nearby mural shows the appointment of the original vampire guardians, and reiterates that the Balance Guardian is the axis of the Circle of Guardians. And that's all we pretty much get about that for right now. We get to the heart of these ruins, and they contain a forge that are similar to those in Soul Reaver 2. Unlike in that game, these elements do not rely on basins scattered around the world, which are all mysteriously missing now, which is why we're doing the whole Soul Reaver Forge mural exposition vehicle again. This forge in particular contains elemental darkness, and as far as the story goes, the elements themselves still mostly act as keys. Raziel leaves the ruins and begins backtracking, and in doing so, he discovers that the cemetery he's been wandering around in contains Kain's mausoleum where he first rose as a vampire. This should remind us that the fledgling Kain should be wandering around right now, playing Blood Omen 1. Still in the cemetery, Raziel gains access to another old vampire chamber with another portal leading to another set of ruins very similar to the first. The murals in this one show the vampires being driven to self-destruction because of the curse that was placed upon them by the Hilden. We should already know about this, but it begs the question what it was about the immortality and taste for blood that devastated them so much. For now, this is just foreshadowing answers that we will get later. So Raziel then moves on to the forge of these ruins and imbues his Reaver with elemental light. Now having mostly relearned a bunch of old news, Raziel is now ready to leave the cemetery and head for the pillars. Shortly after leaving, Raziel comes across more mercenaries, and witnesses one of them become possessed, which is not unlike what happens to Mortanius by the end of the first Blood Omen, giving us one of our first hints that these guys are unspoken. Raziel then stumbles across one more set of ruins before actually reaching the pillars. The murals start becoming more interesting. These ones show that Vorador had been the one to forge the Soul Reaver long ago. In fact, Vorador was the first human to whom vampirism had been passed. He was sired by none other than Janos Audron, as the Hilden blood curse otherwise prevented them from reproducing, and the vampires who lived, such as Janos, were desperate to preserve their bloodline. In this current era, Vorador was still alive, although not for long, so Raziel decided to seek him out as well. These forge and mural ruins that Raziel is exploring begin to contain the ancient entombed spirits of the original vampire Circle Guardians. In this particular case, it's the Nature and Conflict Guardians. They don't have a whole lot to say, and we don't really learn a lot about them. They seem to have perhaps given up on the prophecies, or maybe never even knew about them, but for the most part these guys are just crazy talk and then attack. Once defeated, their souls kind of get filtered through the forge to get absorbed by the Reaver and then imbued with their respective element, in this case fire. I kind of wish this combination of guardians had been conflict and energy based on what they had chosen for Earth, but whatever. There is some slight significance in absorbing the original Guardian souls into the Reaver that kind of ties into the end, but again, there's so much about these guys that's left unsaid. It's also maybe worth noting that Light and Darkness didn't seem to have Guardians associated with them, which maybe there's a good reason for that, I don't know. When Raziel finally gets to the crumbling pillars, he does find Ariel, meeting her for his third time and her first. It's worth mentioning that in Ariel's future meetings, she never remembers Raziel. I find this to be a display of how the long years tied to the pillars and her obsession with Kain's actions have affected her mentally. Raziel says to her that he's only asking for directions, but she says that she only counsels Kain. She already assumes that Raziel is an unspoken, which was the thought that she had when they spoke in Soul Reaver 2. She says to Raziel that she has faith that Kain will make the sacrifice and expel his kind from this world forever. Raziel assures her that she's in denial about the possibility of Kain refusing the sacrifice, but then he just quickly asks for directions to Vorador's manor, saying he'll go away afterwards. She tells Raziel that Vorador lives within the Black Forest, saying he's soon to be hunted by Mobius's mobs. I'm sure she meant Termagant Forest. Raziel then does leave, and in doing so comes across yet another entry into some vampire ruins. These murals are damaged, and they show a prophesied vampire hero meant to bear the Reaver. This kind of isn't really news, but now we're starting to see evidence of a possible adversary to this hero. The spirits in this forge are the former guardians of the Mind and Dimension pillars. They're all sad about stuff, and they pointlessly offer Raziel the release of death. When failing to follow through, their spirits imbue the Reaver with elemental air. Raziel then finishes his trip to Vorador's mansion, and when he arrives, he mentions that Vorador once held court over a decadent kingdom, but it all stands still and quiet thanks to Mobius's mobs. We don't see any vampire servants wandering around like we did in Blood Omen 1, also probably thanks to the fledgling Kain, who's recently been through here. Vorador is even in hiding, and Raziel has to go on a search for him, and in doing so, he does some puzzle stuff and encounters another portal to another set of ruins. The murals here are the same as last time, but these are undamaged and clearly show the adversary is comparable to the vampire warrior and seems to wield a flaming blade. This causes Raziel to wonder if he were the adversary and Kain the vampire hero. If so, then Raziel's free will is in question, Mobius had been right all along, and Raziel is destined to kill Kain. As for the spirits of this forge, we're not told directly, but by process of elimination, we can tell that these are the guardians of the Death and States pillars. Their spirits coming together to imbue the Reaver with water. A morbid but accurate combination, I would say. Returning to the mansion, Raziel is able to find and unlock Vorador's hiding place. Vorador is present, and when approached, he suggests that Raziel himself doesn't know why he came here. As usual, Raziel simply wants answers, and so he asks about the Reaver, and how Vorador seems to know what he is. Vorador confirms that he did in fact forge the Reaver, but he doesn't know anything about the sorceries Janos or the other vampires may have placed on it. He also says he knows just a few bits of prophecies that his sire, Janos Audron, shared with him. Vorador had believed Raziel could be a part of these prophecies, but now believes these prophecies are failing, with the pillars crumbling, his death inevitable, and the fledgling Kain bearing a greater burden than he realizes as the final remaining vampire. Vorador then introduces the fact that he has Janos' corpse with him, and that it's still preserved because the Heart of Darkness still beats out there somewhere. He believes it's located in Avernus, and urges Raziel to search for it, saying Janos would probably have the best answers for him. He then warns Raziel and reminds us that Avernus is in flames because of the presence of an ancient evil, referring to the Unspoken. If you'll also recall, the chaos in Avernus is caused by Azimuth the Planar, the current guardian of the Pillar of Dimension, summoning a whole bunch of demons and stuff. This makes sense. The Hilden have already been known to be pretty friendly with demons, so they're all coming from the same abyss. Raziel just goes to Avernus, specifically Avernus Cathedral. We don't even get to see the chaos in the city, unfortunately. Once more, fledgling Kain has likely been through here recently, killed Azimuth as well as many of the demon types around here, so for now we only see a few spell-slinging priest guys, who might look a bit familiar from Blood Omen. But before getting too far into Avernus, Raziel encounters, you guessed it, another set of ruins. The murals here explain the vampires' reaction to their curse. We see that the ancient vampires believed in the Wheel of Fate and therefore followed the Elder. They had felt that their deity had forsaken them and that their immortality had removed them from the cycle of the Wheel of Fate, so many of them attempted to destroy themselves in order to return to it. The Elder did say something to this effect regarding why he hates vampires at the beginning of Soul Reaver 1. Raziel still believes that the Elder is a soul-leeching parasite on the world and not a god, and is surprised that the Ancients could have been fooled so easily. When meeting the Ancients that reside in this forge, the old guardians of the Time and Energy Pillars, they clearly have Wheel of Fate fever, and I guess they kind of get what they want when their souls are used to imbue the Reaver with Earth. We return to the cathedral and Raziel opens a passage into its depths. We're immediately hit with more history lesson murals. These ones, however, are not of vampire design. These Hilden images show that the ancient vampires are the ones who started their war. Apparently, the ancient vampires didn't like that the Hilden didn't agree with the Wheel of Fate or submit to the Elder. We also see another image of the vampire hero's adversary, the Hilden hero. Raziel has noted how the similarities between himself and this Hilden hero seem quite intentional, and wonders why everyone is trying to claim him as their pawn. The Elder takes this moment to chime in and tries to reinforce to Raziel that he is in fact the vampire savior's enemy, and that Kain probably won't be happy when he comes to this realization. It is at this point that we begin encountering more demons, telling us that we are getting closer to our ancient evil, further made evident when we stumble across some ritual led by the Circle Guardian of Death, Mortanius. Now, Mortanius is very possessed, and we know it, he knows it, so it seems he's doing all of whatever this is, because he's being coerced in some way. However, before Raziel gets to meet Mortanius, he gets yanked into this ritual pit, perhaps some sort of mistake with the ritual, and he meets somebody else first. It turns out the whole point of this ritual is to feed and sustain a large creature that's being contained within this pit. The surrounding cultists chanting refer to it as Ha-Shak-Gik. When this creature reveals itself, it turns out it recognizes Raziel, and remembers Raziel's execution. Raziel then recognizes this creature as Terrell, who, alongside their mutual brother Duma, threw Raziel into the Lake of the Dead at Kain's command. Terrell is the only one of Kain's lieutenants who escaped Raziel's vengeance in Nosgoth's future, and Terrell already seems aware that Raziel has slain their brothers. When asked how he got to this era, Terrell essentially says he was summoned and then doesn't know otherwise. Terrell discusses how the cultists here worship him and how this seems to have transformed him. He still wishes to leave, however, and he's unable to because they prevent him from doing so, which begins to make sense when we learn that Terrell is possessed by the Hilden as well. The Hilden speak through Terrell, and while they're somewhat cryptic about it, they tell Raziel to hurry up with what he's doing because Kain is on his way and he has to go fight him. They also express that Terrell is weakening and he's becoming less suitable as a host for them. Terrell then kind of snaps out of it and then in a hungry rage attacks Raziel. It seems that Terrell's mutation since Raziel's execution has caused him to develop the vampiric vulnerability to certain types of sound. It also seems that the cultists use this vulnerability to keep him contained. Raziel takes advantage of this to claim his vengeance against Terrell. The Hilden don't seem to care too much, and when Terrell's soul is consumed, Raziel gains enhanced telekinetic abilities beyond the projectile that he earned from Terrell's offspring of the future. He uses them to climb out of the pit, and soon comes upon Mortanius, who is sending a message to the fledgling Kain telling him to meet him at the Pillars. We could chalk this up to alterations in the timeline, but I prefer to think of this as like a magical voicemail, as we don't hear this from Mortanius in Blood Omen 1 until after Kain has beheaded Mobius, which hasn't happened just yet. When Raziel addresses him, Mortanius' response is not dissimilar from Ariel's. He's familiar with the vampire prophecies, and is convinced that Raziel is in fact the Hilden hero. The Hilden possessing Mortanius pops out and confirms this to Raziel, and after Mortanius regains control, Raziel asks him about the Heart of Darkness. Mortanius proudly says he used it to create the vampire champion, the Scion of Balance, who is Raziel's destroyer. We'll come back to the whole Scion of Balance thing. Mortanius says he was wrong in ancient times to rise up with Mobius against the ancient vampires to take guardianship from the Pillars, and he used the Heart of Darkness in a bid to restore vampire guardianship. That's kind of all there is to say about Mortanius and Mobius rising up against the vampires, but we'll come back to that as well. Raziel then realizes that the Heart of Darkness beats within Kain's chest, and this helps explain its use to the player in the first Blood Omen. The Hilden in Mortanius pops out one more time and says that it will soon have a stronger vessel, which will also come into play shortly. Mortanius disappears, likely to hunt down Anacroth at the Pillars, leaving Raziel to ponder what he must do next. It's at this point that I want to leave Raziel's side of things and shift over to Kain's perspective. Going back to the beginning of this game, Kain starts off in the era of the Seraphan, returning to the Seraphan Fortress. He's here to ask Mobius about Raziel's whereabouts, so we can assume he's not only getting desperate, but has likely been out searching for Raziel since the events of Soul Reaver 2. Also, notice how Kain has kept the physical Reaver after preventing Raziel's soul from being consumed by it. Throughout Kain's side of things, he assembles an emblem which attaches to the Reaver and enhances it. In the game, it's functionally similar to Raziel's elements, but otherwise is even less significant. Kain encounters Mobius, but for this first meeting, Kain is disabled by Mobius' staff. Mobius takes a moment to taunt Kain, telling him that he's not the Scion of Balance from prophecy, and then moves on to somewhere else in the fortress. This would be the first we've heard about the Scion of Balance. This is sensible in that a massive amount of time would have elapsed since the Blood Omen games, and that would have been the last time we would have directly followed Kain, giving him a lot of time to learn about vampire lore and prophecy that we may not know about. By the end of Defiance, we learn that the Scion of Balance is essentially just a specific Balance Guardian who's destined to restore the Pillars. After Mobius walks away, Kain is attacked by a group of Shades. We've seen Shades quite a bit before, particularly in Soul Reaver 2, but I make so little mention of them because they're more annoying than they are significant. Shades are supposed to be amalgamations of the shattered remnants of malicious souls, another byproduct of the binding of the Pillars failing. Kain catches back up to Mobius, and when he does, Mobius expectantly greets him. Kain is quick to disarm Mobius of his staff, however, and he starts tossing Mobius around. Kain may not have done this on his first meeting with Mobius because there's no telling how much he knew about Mobius' staff. He may not have had any experience with it. Mobius reminds Kain that this is not the time that he dies, but Kain threatens an alternate outcome. Mobius then tells Kain that preventing Raziel's soul from entering the Reaver was meaningless, and that he still sees Kain's fate and Raziel still ends up killing him. Kain then recognizes that Raziel retains his free will, preventing Mobius from seeing his future, which is why Mobius fears him so much. This is maybe as significant as the Reaver convergences which have altered the timeline of history so far, as this means that while Raziel cannot alter history on his own, his specific future actions are exclusively unknown to those such as Mobius and the Elder. When asked where Raziel is, Mobius says he's contained, referring to the underworld, and he's too dangerous to release until it's time for him to enter the Reaver. He tells Kain there's proof of this somewhere west of the Pillars, and then he disappears. Kain flies off in bat form towards the Pillars, where he spots a vampire citadel in the distance, and he keeps flying. When Kain arrives at the Citadel, he mentions he's more interested in his own destiny as the Scion of Balance than he is in Raziel's. Kain comes upon the vampire prophecy that shows the Hilden hero who's meant to challenge the vampire hero. This in particular showed one specific outcome. He comments that this was no doubt the evidence Mobius meant for him to see. Delving further into the Citadel, Kain encounters a familiar-looking portal, which leads to all the same ruins Raziel had been exploring, linking them to each other, but slightly more intact. Going through these ruins, we come to find that Kain is not exempt from exposition from murals, as he encounters one showing how the ancient vampires, after having been cursed, used to adopt or abduct human children who were born as the new Pillar Guardians, and would then pass vampirism onto them when they came of age. The humans grew to dislike this, so eventually they rose up against the vampires and seized the pillars from them. Kain says this is all for the audience's benefit as he knew all this already. What Kain learns that he didn't know is that Mobius and Mortanius were the humans who led the uprising against the vampires, meaning that Mobius and Mortanius are both very old, having been around since then, because of their great longevity granted to them by their Pillar Guardianship. Kain suggests that Mobius hates him because he's the first vampire guardian to exist since those times, either because of its prophetic significance or because it reminds Mobius of what he's forsaken. Kain then sees another set of murals showing the vampire and Hilden heroes locked in combat, with only one of them being destined to survive. Shortly after, Kain returns to a chamber at the center of the Citadel area and unlocks it using pieces of the emblem he's been collecting. Once inside, a familiar voice addresses Kain, saying that he's the oracle of his ancestors. We, the audience, of course, recognize this voice as the Elders speaking to Kain for the first time. I think that the title of Oracle is the Elder God's true and official title, and so I think it's the inspiration that other characters have used when they've used the title of Oracle for themselves throughout the series. The Elder, or Oracle, informs Kain that Raziel is seeking the Heart of Darkness, and that Kain knows what this means, referring to the events of Blood Omen 2. He offers to open a portal to send Kain to the future to confront Raziel at Avernus. Kain is suspicious, but he needs to get to Raziel for multiple reasons, so he admits he has little choice. Kain had suggested that this chamber may have been sealed to keep something in, and between that and this portal, I suspect that this chamber may be the singular place that the ancient vampires communed with the Elder, while also functioning as a time-streaming device. Kain climbs into and out of the portal, emerging in the same chamber, now looking several centuries older. Having seemed to have been straightforward with him so far, the Elder now urges Kain to go kill Raziel. Kain clarifies that Raziel is not his enemy, and flies off straight to Avernus Cathedral, hoping to be able to stop Raziel from raising Janos. Kain's side was much more simple and straightforward, as this is when Raziel and Kain meet, and when they do, Raziel is desperate for answers, and is convinced this confrontation has to happen for him to get them. So, he's persistently questioning Kain's motives and his possible desire to use him. Kain insists that Janos must not be raised, that Raziel should trust him, and that he doesn't want to harm Raziel. Raziel's not really convinced, as Kain is holding the empty Reaver, which will ultimately be consuming Raziel, but Kain may need it if he hopes to change what he knows will occur in Blood Omen 2. Raziel attacks, and Kain defends himself, starting an epic struggle that everyone has been waiting for. Kain briefly gains the upper hand, and he takes the moment to express the great harm that will come from using the Heart of Darkness if it's ever found. Raziel asks Kain if he even knows where the heart is or if he's even bothered to look for it. Kain says he doesn't know and it doesn't matter, and Raziel isn't bound by destiny or these prophecies, and he has the opportunity to make a choice. Raziel, not wanting to make a choice at the behest of another, continues his assault against Kain. Now, knowing that Kain doesn't know where the heart is, tells me that he's so desperate to prevent Janos from being raised, not so much because he fears the Seraphan Lord, because that all works out for him, but possibly more so because he doesn't want to lose Janos to the Abyss at the end of the events of Blood Omen 2. Their struggle is interrupted by a moment when Raziel begins slipping into the Reaver through Kain's body. There's a weird moment of hesitation where I think Kain realizes he was so desperate to change things that he didn't really have a plan, and sealing Raziel within the blade wasn't an option. Raziel manages to tear himself away, and in angry retaliation, rips Kain's heart from his chest and casts him into the depths of Avernus Cathedral. After the dust settles, Raziel, having claimed the Heart of Darkness, admits that the madness within Avernus somehow fueled his rage. He felt he'd only walked blindly into a trap laid out by the Hilden, and he wasn't sure if Kain truly meant him harm, and now he feared he'd never know. Raziel returns to Vorador's ransacked mansion, where he finds Mobius, who congratulates him for killing Kain. Raziel asks about Vorador, and Mobius confirms that they have him and are soon going to execute him. Now, we can be sure that the alterations to the timeline up to this point don't cause Vorador to somehow survive this, as it would completely undermine Mobius' plan to make Kain the last remaining vampire before he needs to make his sacrifice. We know Mobius still retains his foresight over others, especially considering that Vorador's death was initially a planned result of a change in the timeline, and so, unfortunately, Vorador cannot actually survive to see Blood Omen 2. When Raziel asks Mobius about his own death, he says he's satisfied going to it knowing he served his role in his master's plans. Mobius says he doesn't care which hero either Kain or Raziel thought they were, as long as Raziel killed Kain. Mobius confirms Raziel's free will and applauds his own ability to manipulate him, which doesn't sit very well with Raziel. Mobius then leaves to attend Vorador's and his own execution, leaving Raziel to tear through mercenaries to get to Janos' body. He gets to Janos and returns to him the Heart of Darkness, hoping it to be worth the price of everything he had forsaken. When Janos awakens, Raziel fills him in on how he's been asleep for 5 centuries and how the vampires are now being exterminated. When Janos prompts Raziel to act quickly, Raziel demands answers about the Reaver, saying he didn't do this as a favor. Janos confirms to Raziel that his presence does foretell the salvation of the vampire race, and that he is in fact destined to wield the Reaver, not be consumed by it. When Raziel reveals that he does wield the Reaver, just not as the ancients had imagined, Janos is a bit surprised, and he admits that Raziel's destiny may be much more labyrinthian than he realized. He brings Raziel to a familiar-looking citadel, though this specific part of it would really only look familiar to Kain, and says this is where the ancients witnessed the summoning of the Pillars. Janos knows the binding of the Pillars is straining, and when Raziel suggests that they're doomed, Janos says that there's still hope as long as a single vampire, such as Kain, remains. He also says, as Kain did in Soul Reaver 2, that humans are not competent to retain their guardianship over the Pillars. Raziel then asks how the vampires lost their guardianship in the first place, and Janos gives us a history lesson that we've mostly already learned. Janos regrets how immortality expelled the vampires from the cycle of death and rebirth, and that he had to pass that immortality on to humans, causing the uprising in the first place. But he said it was a necessary sacrifice, given the importance of maintaining the binding of the Pillars. The way Janos talked about it suggested to me that his faith in the Oracle and the Wheel of Fate may have been shaken, but that he's still certain of a natural and necessary life and death cycle. Which makes sense to me. I think the Sluaw that we encounter so often are a part of that natural cycle. Janos then directs Raziel to the vampire's innermost sanctum, located beneath this room, saying that's where he'll find his answers about himself and the Reaver. He says that this is one of those things that Raziel must do for himself and disappears. Raziel passes through the chamber from which Kain recently emerged, and continues in deeper to find the Elder waiting for him. The Elder tells Raziel that now that Kain is dead, it was his fate that mattered, not Raziel's, confirming that he knew that Kain was in fact the Scion of Balance. And regarding Raziel's destiny, at least as to whether he's the vampire or the Hilden hero, we do kind of get vague confirmations about it. Janos did tell Raziel that he was destined to bear the Reaver, making him the vampire hero, but the Hilden were also quick to claim him as their hero. So he's both, and the whole point of the prophecy is to represent Raziel's free will and his ability to choose. This kind of begs the question, why would the vampires foresee a Hilden hero if it would only sow confusion? It could very well just be a storytelling device, but we never come to understand how the prophecies came to be, so they could have just been vague from the start. It's also very possible that the Elder had a hand in making the prophecies more unclear so he could manipulate people in the future. I guess we'll never really know. Anyway, coming back to the Vampire Sanctum. This room contains what looks like one of those elemental forges, and the Oracle clearly doesn't want Raziel to get to it. Through a series of puzzles, Raziel is able to force the Oracle aside and activate the forge, causing Ariel to appear. When she emerges, Ariel says that the veil has been lifted and she finally recognizes Raziel. She says this forge has summoned the spirits of herself and all of her predecessors through time, meaning the spirits of all of the Balance Guardians except for Kain. I believe this is likely the latest iteration of Ariel, summoned from the future, as she otherwise wouldn't be able to appear to Raziel at other points in his timeline. She tells Raziel to use their spirits to baptize and purify the Reaver, then arm the Scion of Balance to purify him as well. Raziel does this, and it should remind us of something we saw in Soul Reaver 1. Believing Kain to be dead, and again feeling like he's left with more questions than answers, Raziel returns to Janos. When he arrives, the binding of the pillars is failing just before the moment Kain refuses the sacrifice. Janos tells Raziel that hope still remains if he finds the Scion of Balance, just as the pillars shatter, which gives us a little insight about Janos' vague knowledge regarding Kain's specific actions. Moments after the pillars shatter, Janos comes under the control of an Unspoken who, from the events of Blood Omen 2, we should know is the Seraphan Lord. Once again, the bad guy tells Raziel how he's been manipulated the whole time and how everything from Kain's involvement in the fall of the Circle to Raziel seeking the Heart of Darkness had been orchestrated, all so that the Hilden could gain a foothold in Nosgoth through Janos. We also know from Blood Omen 2 that at least this part of their plan involving Janos is doomed to fail, but that still leaves the issue of the binding of the pillars failing and Nosgoth decaying as a result. Raziel says he's willing to destroy Janos if it puts a stop to the Seraphan Lord, and they fight. Raziel eventually gains the upper hand, but he can't bring himself to finish the job and he hesitates. The Seraphan Lord quickly takes this opportunity to blast Raziel into the spectral realm, and then he flies off into the events of Blood Omen 2. Raziel awakens to find himself back in the chamber where he purified the Reaver, and the Elder is there taunting him, telling him that his job is finished and he's to be imprisoned in the spectral realm until the time comes for him to enter the physical Reaver. The Elder calls out to Mobius' soul, which tells us that Mobius has been beheaded by the fledgling Kain by now, and then we shift back over to Kain's perspective. Kain awakens in a shadowy realm resembling the vaults of Avernus, and he confirms that Janos' heart is no longer within him, and wonders how he lives. We then hear angry Hilden voices tell him that this is the realm to which the vampires banished them. Reaver still in hand, Kain fights his way through this realm to a portal that exits to Tyrell's chamber in Avernus' depths. I'm not certain how deep into the demon realm this is. Perhaps Kain's escape was as possible and easy as it was because this was merely a pocket of the demon realm, or the binding was just particularly thin here. In either case, it would likely be because of all the rituals performed in this area. Beyond that, I want to take a moment to discuss how and why Kain survived. So, to my understanding, the official explanation as to why Kain isn't dead is because he is the Scion of Balance, and his destiny wouldn't allow him to die. This never really sat right with me for several reasons. Not only is it really vague, but Mobius and the Elder would have known that it would have taken something extraordinary to disrupt that destiny, such as when Raziel was destined to destroy Kain, body and soul, with the possessed Soul Reaver. And so they shouldn't have just assumed that Kain had really died. I think, however, that I've got an alternate, sensible explanation that I feel fits pretty well with the established story so far. So it had already been established in Blood Omen 2 that the demon realm to which the Hilden had been banished provides a sort of immortality in how it twists them body and soul, not unlike vampirism. I think we could say that Kain's brief time in that demonic pocket dimension caused that demonic influence to affect him, possibly interacting with his vampirism, allowing him to persist without a heart. This explanation offers a little more significance to the fact that the showdown between Kain and Raziel happened within Avernus Cathedral, and can help explain why Kain's survival wouldn't be known to Mobius or the Elder. Because Raziel's destiny is shrouded, he made an unknowable, spontaneous decision to blast Kain into the depths of Avernus, which had less foreseeable consequences on Kain. This could also likely mean that Janos would be nearly impossible to destroy after having fallen into the demon realm at the end of Blood Omen 2, and is definitely still out there somewhere. Anyway, those are just my thoughts on the whole Kain dying situation. Moving back to the story, Kain, still in Avernus, says he feels compelled to go to the vampire citadel, and without a lead from here, it's as good a place as any, so why not? He fights his way out of the cathedral and flies to the citadel. Once there, he takes in the view of the newly destroyed pillars and reflects on his refusal of the sacrifice and the execution of Raziel as a bid against destiny, wondering if he misread all the signs in his arrogance as Mobius said he did. He descends into the inner chamber where Raziel is in the spectral realm, and there he encounters a newly resurrected Mobius, who is saying something about the Hilden being an inconvenience soon to be dealt with, talking to nobody visible, but we know is his master, the Elder. Mobius is surprised to see Kain here, which we don't get out of him very often, and he tries to use his staff on Kain, which doesn't have any effect without his vampiric heart. And if it weren't for this moment, we could have had an explanation like Kain's original heart was vitalized with unlife and replaced the Heart of Darkness, allowing Kain's continued existence. But oh well. Kain taunts Mobius, saying that his powers are failing, and there might be some truth to this as there's some weird implications regarding his resurrection and his guardianship. His pillar still was restored after his death, after all. Kain runs Mobius through with the Reaver, killing him for a second time, but Mobius laughs it off, saying his master will only resurrect him again. Mobius' spirit reawakens in the spectral realm, with Raziel standing just behind him, and he's just as happy to see Mobius as Kain was. Mobius lets slip aloud that Kain is still alive, just before Raziel runs him through as well with his newly imbued Reaver. And when he does, the new purifying aspect of the Reaver seems to allow Mobius to see the Oracle for the big squid thing that it really is. And then we finally get to see Raziel feed on Mobius' soul, ending his existence and sending him to his Wheel of Fate. The Elder tells Raziel that his actions don't matter as he was finished with Mobius anyway, and while this is probably just to get under Raziel's skin, this sort of leads me to believe that the Elder might consume Mobius' soul in some form or another in all the other timelines regardless. Now knowing that Kain is alive, Raziel says that the Oracle hasn't the means to destroy either of them. The Elder retorts that maybe he doesn't, but he can just bury them both in the Citadel for all eternity and be done with it. Clearly a very desperate threat. Raziel stops for a moment to think on how the ancient vampires may have never realized what the Oracle truly was, and knowing now how the purifying qualities of the Reaver reveal this nature, he reflects on how all the conflict throughout history was to deliberately fuel the Oracle's Wheel of Fate, and that he was Nosgoth's true enemy. Saying he knows what needs to be done, Raziel goes to possess the newly slain corpse of Mobius, which awakens in the material realm right in front of Kain. Kain is more than happy to stab Mobius' animated body again, just before Raziel is able to reveal his true form. As he does so, Kain immediately expresses regret as his material Reaver is already absorbing Raziel's spirit. Raziel holds the Reaver, preventing Kain from removing it, saying that this is the only way. Raziel says he understands the Reaver, and that it, now purified, is meant to heal the sign of balance, and that he is not Kain's enemy, but rather, as it had been before, he is Kain's right hand and sword. He directs Kain to their true enemy as he dissipates into the Reaver, cleansing him of the corruption that was inflicted upon the Circle by the Mind Guardian, Napraptor. The Elder, now revealed to Kain, threatens him as he did Raziel with entombment within the Citadel. Kain retorts that the Elder wouldn't need to take such measures unless he feared him and Raziel, prompting him to start slicing and a clash ensues. As they conflict, the Citadel still collapses, but Kain easily escapes, and the Oracle, now weakened, exclaimed that he cannot be destroyed and that he will one day claim Kain's soul. Kain just brushes him off, and this whole scene kind of looks like it sets Kain up as a gatekeeper against the Oracle in the future. Kain returns to where he can overlook the pillars and reflects on the gifts Raziel left him, naming off the sword, clarity to see, and of course, best of all, hope. We're still, however, left with quite a few unanswered questions, such as what does it mean for Nosgoth if the Elder Kain is free of corruption? Nosgoth is destined to decay anyway, so will new Pillar Guardians be born in the distant future, and will Nosgoth recover? Also, the conflict with the Hilden wasn't really completely resolved. The binding of the pillars is still destined to fail as well, so they likely still pose a threat and could make more efforts to break through the veil. And one other thing I'm curious about worth mentioning, Kain still needs to return the Soul Reaver to Avernus in the past for his fledgling self to receive it. However, the Soul Reaver won't purify him the first time he acquires it for whatever reason. Perhaps the Reaver lost its purifying qualities over time as it became closer to the ravenous spirit that Raziel feared becoming so much. Anyway, with this being the last real entry, at least as far as the story goes, to the series, all we can really do is speculate. And that'll do it. I appreciate you all listening to me drone on this long about this series, and thank you all for watching.
Woe to the conquered!